Hey everyone, before I get into this crazy story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let me tell you about the time I had to deal with the most entitled HOA board member you've ever heard of, and how it completely backfired on her. It started on a regular Thursday morning in March. I was working from home in my garage workshop, which I'd converted into a woodworking space where I create custom furniture. It's my passion, my side business, and most importantly, it's completely within my property rights, or so I thought. I was in the middle of finishing up a commissioned dining room table when I heard the distinct sound of someone clearing their throat. Standing in my driveway was Patricia Wilson, or Pat, as she insisted everyone call her, wearing her signature pearl necklace and that condescending smile that made my stomach turn. She was clutching her iPad like it was some sort of weapon, and I knew right away this wasn't going to be a friendly neighbor visit. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I've received several complaints about your operation here." She gestured vaguely at my workshop with a manicured hand. "The Pine Valley Estates HOA board has concerns about running a business from your home. It's a clear violation of our residential-only policy." I set down my sander and took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time Pat had tried to throw her weight around as an HOA board member, but it was the first time she'd directly targeted my workshop. "Pat, I've checked the bylaws thoroughly. Home-based businesses are permitted as long as they don't create excessive noise or traffic. I've been doing this for 2 years without any issues." Her smile tightened. "Well, things are changing, Mark. The board is implementing stricter interpretations of our rules. That industrial-looking garage door you installed last summer, the extra electrical work, the occasional delivery truck, it's all becoming quite problematic." I felt my blood pressure rising. The garage door was a high-quality upgrade that actually improved the neighborhood's appearance, and the electrical work was all properly permitted. "Everything I've done is up to code and approved by the city. I have all the documentation." "Documentation?" Pat laughed, a short, sharp sound. "The HOA board has final say on what's acceptable in our community, and we've decided your workshop needs to go. You have 30 days to cease operations and return the garage to its original state." I stood up straight, wiping my hands on my work apron. "And if I don't?" Pat's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Then you'll be facing fines of $200 per day, and we'll place a lien on your property if necessary. We're quite serious about maintaining the residential character of Pine Valley Estates." Just then, my wife Jennifer came out, probably having heard the conversation through the open window of her home office. She's usually the diplomatic one in our relationship, but even she looked stunned by Pat's audacity. "Pat, this is ridiculous," Jen said, moving to stand beside me. "Mark's workshop has never been a problem. In fact, he's made furniture for half the neighbors, including your own daughter's wedding present." Pat waved her hand dismissively. "Personal feelings don't matter here. Rules are rules, and as an HOA board member, it's my duty to enforce them." She tapped something on her iPad and looked up with that same smug smile. "You'll receive the official notice by email within the hour. I suggest you start making arrangements to comply." As she turned to leave, she paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mark, those wood scraps by your trash bin, they need to be properly disposed of by tomorrow, or that'll be another violation." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the concrete with infuriating precision. Jen grabbed my arm, probably sensing I was about to say something we'd regret. But in that moment, looking at my workshop, the space I'd spent years perfecting, where I'd built not just furniture, but a dream, I knew this wasn't going to end the way Pat thought. It would. "She can't do this," Jen said quietly. "We need to fight back." I nodded, already pulling out my phone. "Oh, we will, but first, I'm calling Sandy Cohen. If Pat wants to play hardball, she's about to learn she picked the wrong workshop to mess with. Within an hour, Pat's email arrived, full of legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. But instead of intimidating me, it just strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about my workshop anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who'd finally gone too far. The moment Sandy Cohen's number appeared on my phone screen, I knew we had a fighting chance. Sandy wasn't just any lawyer. She was known throughout Riverside for taking on cases exactly like this and winning them. Her voice crackled through the speaker with the kind of confidence that made you believe anything was possible. "Mark, I've reviewed the HOA bylaws for Pine Valley Estates," Sandy said, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "Pat Wilson's interpretation is not just wrong, it's potentially actionable. Home-based businesses are explicitly permitted under Section 7(3), with reasonable restrictions. Your workshop meets every single requirement." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by anger as I remembered Pat's smug expression. "So, what's our next move?" "First, we document everything," Sandy replied. "Every interaction, every email, every friendly visit from Pat. But more importantly, we need to show community support. How many neighbors have you made furniture for?" I thought about it for a moment. "At least 15 families in the neighborhood. Maybe more." "Perfect. We're going to need statements from them, but be careful. Pat's going to try to isolate you, make you feel like you're alone in this fight." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a neighborhood app notification. Pat had already posted a lengthy message about maintaining property values and preventing commercial activities in our residential area. She hadn't named me directly, but everyone would know who she was talking about. The responses started flowing in immediately. Some neighbors, like Linda Reynolds, were quick to agree with Pat, commenting about protecting our investment and maintaining standards. But then something unexpected happened. Dave Martinez, who lived 3 houses down, posted a photo of the custom entertainment center I'd built for his family last Christmas. If protecting property values means losing talented craftsmen like Mark Anderson, then maybe we need to reassess our priorities, Dave wrote. His workshop has never been a nuisance, and his work has added value to many of our homes. More supportive comments followed. Mike and Susan Chen shared photos of their dining room set. Tom Rodriguez defended the quality of my work and the professional way I ran my business. Even Carol from the end of the street, who I barely knew, chimed in about how my workshop actually increased the neighborhood's appeal. Jen came into the garage, her laptop in hand. "You need to see this," she said, showing me an email chain. She'd been forwarded by Diana Foster, another HOA board member. In it, Pat had been pushing for stricter enforcement of home business regulations for months, but she'd only started targeting specific residents after her daughter's wedding. The same wedding where she'd demanded a custom table from me, then tried to pay less than half my quoted price. "This isn't about the bylaws at all," Jen said, her eyes wide with realization. "This is personal." I was about to respond when we heard a commotion outside. Bob Thompson, the HOA president, was standing in our driveway with Pat and 2 other board members, Peggy Stevens and Bill Parker. They looked like they were conducting some sort of unofficial inspection. "Time to face the music," I muttered. To Jen, stepping outside to confront them, Bob at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mark, we're just doing a routine check of reported violations," he started, but Pat cut him off. "We've documented multiple infractions," she announced, that familiar superior smile playing on her lips. "The industrial-grade ventilation system, the frequency of deliveries, the storage of materials." She gestured to my perfectly organized wood rack. "This is clearly a commercial operation. far beyond what could be considered a hobby workshop. I felt a strange calm settle over me. You're right about one thing, Pat. This isn't a hobby. It's a legally operated, properly permitted home business, and I have documentation for every single violation you've just listed. Pat's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. The board has already made its decision. You can either comply with the cease and desist order or what? Sandy's voice rang out from behind us. She was walking up my driveway, a thick folder tucked under her arm, because I'd be very interested in hearing the board explain its selective enforcement of bylaws in court, especially given the other home-based businesses operating in Pine Valley Estates. The color drained from Pat's face. Other businesses? Sandy smiled, pulling out a sheet of paper. Linda Reynolds' thriving real estate office, Bill Parker's accounting practice, and isn't your own daughter running a pretty successful social media consulting business from your house, Pat? Bob Thompson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this at the next board meeting. Excellent idea, Sandy replied. I'm sure the whole neighborhood would be interested in understanding why Mark's workshop has been singled out for enforcement, while other home businesses have operated freely for years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Pat tried to interject, but Sandy wasn't finished. And while we're at it, we can discuss the proper procedures for board members to recuse themselves from decisions involving personal vendettas, especially when those vendettas stem from failed attempts to manipulate pricing for custom furniture. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a saw. Pat's face had gone from pale to red, her carefully maintained composure cracking. This is ridiculous. I'm simply enforcing the rules. Save it for the meeting, Pat, Sandy cut her off, and I suggest you review the HOA's own bylaws about board member conduct before then. Section 12.1 is particularly relevant, the part about abuse of power and personal conflicts of interest. As the group retreated down my driveway, I could hear Pat's shrill voice arguing with Bob about procedures and authority. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like we had the upper hand. Inside, Jen was already on the phone with Diana Foster, who was apparently having second thoughts about supporting Pat's campaign against us. The tide was turning, and Pat's perfect plan was starting to unravel, but something told me she wasn't going to go down without a fight. I turned back to my workshop, running my hand along the smooth surface of the unfinished dining table. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but for now I had work to do, and unlike Pat Wilson, my work actually brought value to this community. The morning of the HOA board meeting arrived with an unexpected twist. Someone had plastered printed copies of Pine Valley Estates home business bylaws on every mailbox in the neighborhood. The highlighted sections made it crystal clear. My workshop was completely within regulations. I had a pretty good idea who was behind it, and when I saw Diana Foster power walking past my house with a satisfied smile, my suspicions were confirmed. But Pat Wilson wasn't going down without a fight. By mid-morning, she'd organized an impromptu emergency community meeting in her backyard. From my workshop, I could see people filtering in through her garden gate, mostly the same crowd that always backed her power plays. Linda Reynolds was there, clutching a stack of papers that probably contained more violations she'd documented. The whole scene reminded me of a war council. Frank Miller, the building inspector, chose that exact moment to show up for his scheduled inspection of my workshop. Pat had apparently filed multiple complaints about unsafe modifications to my garage, hoping to find some legitimate reason to shut me down. What she didn't know was that Frank and I had history. I'd built his wife's dream kitchen island last summer. "Let's make this official," Frank said with a wink, pulling out his clipboard. He spent the next hour meticulously checking every aspect of my workshop setup. The ventilation system, properly installed and up to code, electrical modifications, all permitted and professionally done. Storage arrangements exceeding safety requirements. "Mark," Frank said as he finished up, "this is one of the cleanest, best organized home workshops I've seen in 20 years of inspections. Mind if I take some photos? I'd like to use this as an example for other home-based craftsmen." I could see Pat watching from her yard, her face growing redder by the minute as Frank documented my completely legitimate setup. The emergency meeting in her backyard was getting louder, voices carrying across the perfectly manicured lawns that separated our properties. Officer Chris Johnson pulled up just as Frank was leaving. Apparently, someone had called in a noise, complaint about my workshop, on a day when I hadn't even turned on a single power tool. Chris looked embarrassed as he explained why he was there. "I have to follow up on all complaints," he said apologetically, "but I can already tell this is a waste of time. You know this is the third call we've gotten about your property this week, all from the same number." I shook my head, understanding exactly what Pat was trying to do. "Let me guess, all at times when I wasn't even working." Chris nodded, making a note in his report. "Look, Mark, between you and me, this kind of harassment could actually backfire on the complainant. We take false reports seriously." As Chris left, Mike Chen came rushing over from Pat's gathering looking concerned. "You need to hear what they're planning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Pat's trying to push through an emergency board vote tonight to change the home business regulations. She's gathered supporters to pack the meeting." Jennifer, who'd been working from home to document everything, immediately got on the phone with Sandy. Our lawyer's response was immediate and clear. "They can't do that. Board procedure requires advance notice for bylaw changes. Tell Mark to record everything at tonight's meeting." The community center was packed that evening. I'd never seen so many people at a board meeting. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out. The tension in the room was palpable as Bob Thompson called the meeting to order, with Pat sitting at his right hand, practically vibrating, with barely contained energy. "Before we begin," Bob started, "I want to remind everyone that this is a regular board meeting, not a special session for bylaw amendments." He shot a pointed look at Pat, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Pat's hand shot up immediately. "Point of order. We have an urgent community issue that requires immediate action. I move to add an emergency vote to tonight's agenda regarding commercial activities in residential zones." That's when Sandy stood up from her seat in the back row. "I believe the board should be aware that any attempt to modify bylaws without proper notice would constitute a violation of both HOA procedures and state law. I have here notifications of intent to file complaints from 17 homeowners if such a vote is attempted." The room erupted in murmurs. Pat's face went from red to purple. "This is outrageous. We have a petition signed by concerned residents. A petition gathered under false pretenses," Dave Martinez interrupted, standing up. "Half the people who signed it didn't even know what they were supporting. You told us it was about community standards, but conveniently left out that it was targeting specific residents." More voices joined in, and suddenly the meeting was no longer about my workshop. Years of Pat's manipulations and selective enforcement came pouring out. The time she tried to fine the Rodriguez family for their holiday decorations while ignoring similar displays by her friends. The way she'd pressured the Chens to change their garden design because it wasn't aesthetically appropriate, code for not matching her personal taste. Diana Foster cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "As a board member, I feel compelled to share some concerns about recent actions taken without full board approval." She pulled out a folder. "I have here documentation of multiple instances where board member Wilson has acted unilaterally, exceeding her authority and potentially exposing the HOA to liability." Pat jumped to her feet. "This is a coordinated attack. I've done nothing but try to protect our property values and community standards. By harassing residents who don't give you special treatment." Jennifer's voice cut through the chaos. She stood up, tablet in hand. "I have here emails showing how this campaign against our workshop started immediately after you tried to demand a 60% discount on custom furniture. When Mark refused to undervalue his work, you suddenly discovered all these violations." The room fell silent. Bob Thompson looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Pat," he said quietly, "is this true?" Pat's composure finally cracked. "He's running a furniture factory in our residential neighborhood. The noise, the traffic, the constant deliveries, all of which are within bylaws and have been officially inspected," Sandy interjected smoothly, holding up Frank Miller's report. "The only documented complaints have come from you or people you've influenced. Meanwhile, I have statements from 23 neighbors praising Mr. Anderson's contribution to the community." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Pat tried to defend herself, but each explanation only dug her deeper into a hole of obvious bias and personal vendetta. By the time Bob called for a recess, it was clear that this had become much bigger than just my workshop. The entire power structure of Pine Valley Estates HOA was being questioned, and Pat Wilson was at the center of it all. During the board meeting recess, the community center's parking lot became a flurry of hushed conversations and urgent phone calls. Bob Thompson had retreated to his car, presumably to consult with the HOA's legal counsel. Pat Wilson huddled, with her remaining supporters near the building's entrance, her gestures becoming increasingly animated as she tried to maintain control of her crumbling narrative. I stood off to the side with Jennifer and Sandy, watching the chaos unfold when Diana Foster approached us, clutching her phone with trembling hands. "You won't believe what I just found in my email archives," she whispered, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "Pat's been running her own business consulting firm from her home office for the past 3 years. She's even listed Pine Valley Estates as her business address on state registration documents." Sandy's eyebrows shot up. "Send that to me immediately," she said, already pulling out her laptop. "This goes beyond selective enforcement. It's pure hypocrisy." The revelation spread through the crowd like wildfire. Linda Reynolds, who'd been one of Pat's staunchest supporters, suddenly seemed less certain about her position. I watched as she pulled away from Pat's group, making her way toward the parking lot with a troubled expression. Inside my pocket, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike Chen. "Check your security cameras from this afternoon. Pat was in your driveway while you were at lunch." My heart rate spiked. Jennifer and I had installed security cameras after the false noise complaints started, but I hadn't thought to check them today. I pulled up the footage on my phone, and what I saw made my blood boil. There was Pat, bold as brass, measuring my driveway with a tape measure and photographing my workshop through the windows. She'd even tried the door handle. "Sandy," I said, showing her the footage, "is this what I think it is?" Our lawyer's eyes narrowed as she watched the video. "That's trespassing pure and simple, and attempting to enter a private structure. Officer Johnson needs to see this." As if on cue, Chris Johnson's patrol car pulled into the parking lot. Apparently, someone had called in a complaint about the disruptive gathering at the community center. Pat's desperate attempts to maintain control were becoming increasingly transparent. The officer had just finished reviewing my security footage when Bob Thompson emerged from his car, his face set in grim determination. "Everyone back inside," he announced. "We need to resolve this tonight." The meeting resumed with a different energy. The earlier chaos had been replaced by a focused tension. Bob took his place at the center of the board table, but notably asked Pat to move to the general seating area. "Given the nature of the allegations," he explained, It would be inappropriate for you to participate in this discussion as a board member. Pat's face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous. I have every right. Pat, Bob cut her off, his voice firm. You have the right to address the board as a resident, but given the evidence of personal conflicts of interest, you cannot participate in any official capacity until these matters are resolved. Sandy stood up, her presence commanding immediate attention. I have here documented evidence of multiple violations of HOA bylaws and state regulations, all committed by board member Wilson. She began laying out the case methodically. The unauthorized property inspections, the selective enforcement of regulations, the undisclosed home business, and now the trespassing incident. Pat jumped to her feet. Everything I've done has been for the good of this community. We can't have people turning their homes into factories like you've turned your home into a consulting office. Diana Foster interjected, projecting Pat's business registration documents onto the wall. At least Mark's business provides tangible value to our community. When was the last time your consulting firm did anything for Pine Valley Estates except generate income for you? The room erupted in murmurs again, but this time they were pointed and purposeful. Residents began standing up, sharing their own experiences of Pat's selective enforcement and personal vendettas. Tom Rodriguez described how Pat had threatened to fine him for his home-based graphic design business while ignoring similar setups throughout the neighborhood. Carol, from the end of the street, revealed how Pat had tried to pressure her into using her consulting services by hinting at potential HOA violations that could mysteriously disappear. As the testimonies continued, Pat's remaining supporters began to distance themselves visibly. Linda Reynolds even stood up to apologize for her role in spreading false information about my workshop. Officer Johnson, who had stayed to monitor the situation, stepped forward to address the board. I feel obligated to inform everyone that the police department has documented multiple instances of false reports regarding Mr. Anderson's property, all traced back to the same source. Additionally, the security footage I've just reviewed shows clear evidence of criminal trespassing. Pat's face went pale. This was spiraling far beyond her attempts to shut down my workshop. Her entire carefully constructed position of authority was unraveling in real time. Bob Thompson cleared his throat. In light of this evidence, I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in Board Member Wilson's ability to serve this community. This vote will be conducted by secret ballot to prevent any potential retaliation. You can't do this! Pat shrieked, her composure completely shattered. I built this community. I've protected our property values. Without me. Without you, Jennifer interrupted calmly. We might actually have the peaceful, supportive community we all moved here for. The vote was swift and decisive. Out of 7 board members, 6 voted to remove Pat from her position immediately. The 7th vote, Pat's own, was declared invalid due to conflict of interest. But the evening wasn't over. Bob Thompson had one more announcement. Given the severity of the violations uncovered tonight, the board will be conducting a full audit of all decisions made during Pat Wilson's tenure. Any residents who believe they were unfairly targeted should submit their documentation to the board's new ethics committee, which will be headed by Diana Foster. As the meeting finally adjourned, I watched Pat storm out of the community center, already on her phone, with what I assumed was her personal lawyer, but for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe freely. My workshop was safe. The community had seen through Pat's manipulation, and maybe, just maybe, Pine Valley Estates could become a better place without her influence. The morning after Pat's removal from the board brought an eerie silence to Pine Valley Estates. Her house stood dark and quiet, luxury SUV conspicuously absent from the driveway. The neighborhood message board, usually buzzing with her constant community updates, remained untouched. But something about that silence felt dangerous, like the calm before a storm. My instincts proved right when Jennifer called me from her office around noon. "Mark, you need to check your email right now," she said, her voice tense. "Pat's lawyer just sent something to the entire neighborhood." I opened my inbox to find a lengthy, formally worded message that could only be described as nuclear. Pat was threatening to sue not just me, but the entire HOA board for defamation, harassment, and what she called conspiracy to destroy her professional reputation. The letter included vague references to documented evidence of widespread bylaw violations that she'd allegedly been investigating for months. Sandy called before I could even finish reading the email. "Don't respond to anything," she instructed firmly. "This is exactly what I expected. Pat's trying to intimidate people into backing down. Notice how she copied the entire neighborhood? She's hoping someone will panic and turn on the board to avoid legal troubles." While I was on the phone with Sandy, Dave Martinez texted me a photo. Pat's daughter was parked across from my workshop, obviously taking pictures with her phone. "Thought you should know," Dave wrote. "She's been there for about 20 minutes, and I felt my jaw clench, using her daughter to do her dirty work. That was a new low, even for Pat." But before I could decide how to handle it, Officer Johnson's patrol car rolled up to my driveway. He'd apparently received another noise complaint, this time about industrial equipment operating outside permitted hours. "I know this is bogus," Chris said apologetically, "but I have to document that I responded, though I find it interesting that the complaint came in while I was driving past your completely silent workshop 10 minutes ago." He made a show of noting the time and lack of activity, then added quietly, "You might want to keep recording everything. This kind of harassment usually escalates before it stops." He was right. By mid-afternoon, Linda Reynolds was going door to door with a petition demanding an emergency neighborhood meeting to reconsider Pat's removal from the board. She didn't get many signatures, but she made sure to tell everyone about Pat's plans to file individual lawsuits against anyone who had spoken against her at the meeting. The threats might have worked a few weeks ago, but the community had changed. Mike and Susan Chen invited several neighbors over for dinner specifically to discuss Pat's intimidation tactics. Tom Rodriguez, who worked in marketing, started a private online group for residents to share documentation of Pat's past abuses of power. Every threat she made seemed to strengthen the neighborhood's resolve. Diana Foster called an emergency board meeting to address Pat's legal threats. This time, they met at her house to avoid any public confrontation. Bob Thompson looked exhausted as he shared the HOA's legal team's assessment. "Her case has no merit," he explained, rubbing his temples. "We followed every procedure correctly. Her removal was properly voted on and documented. But she can still cause problems with frivolous lawsuits, even if she ultimately loses. She's counting on—" That, Sandy interjected. "Her lawyer's letter is carefully worded to imply serious allegations without actually making specific claims. It's a classic intimidation tactic." Jennifer, who'd been quietly taking notes on her laptop, suddenly sat up straighter. "Wait a minute," she said, pulling up an old email. "Look at the date Pat registered her consulting business. It was 3 days after she joined the HOA board. And the address she used." Sandy leaned in to look at the screen, her eyes widening. "She used the HOA's official mailing address for her business registration. That's not just unethical, it's potentially fraudulent." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Pat hadn't just been running a home business while trying to shut down others. She'd been using her HOA position to legitimize her company. A quick search revealed she'd even used her board membership in her marketing materials, implying official HOA endorsement of her services. "This changes everything," Sandy said, already typing furiously on her laptop. "She's opened herself up to serious liability. I'm going to need statements from anyone who felt pressured to use her consulting services because of her HOA position." And if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "You won't believe what I just found," it read, followed by screenshots of emails from Pat. In them, she explicitly offered to resolve Carol's supposed HOA violations if Carol hired her as a business consultant. There was even a pricing sheet attached. "Forward those to me immediately," Sandy instructed when I showed her, "and ask Carol if she's willing to make a formal statement. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need." The next few hours were a blur of activity. More residents came forward with similar stories. Pat had apparently been running a complex scheme, using her HOA position to generate clients for her. Consulting business. She'd create or exaggerate violations, then offer her services as a solution. Those who hired her mysteriously found their HOA problems disappearing. Those who refused faced increasing harassment. By evening, Sandy had compiled enough evidence to go on the offensive. She drafted a response to Pat's lawyer that detailed every instance of her abuse of power and professional misconduct. The message was clear. If Pat wanted a legal battle, she'd face much more serious consequences than a lost board position. "Send it to her lawyer only," Sandy advised. "No need to copy the neighborhood this time. Let her wonder how many people are talking to us." As I walked Sandy to her car, I noticed Pat's daughter driving past again, still taking pictures. But this time, instead of feeling angry, I felt almost sorry for her. She was just another pawn in her mother's game of control and manipulation. "Mark," Sandy said, following my gaze, "I know it's tempting to engage, but stay focused. Pat's trying to provoke a reaction she can use against you. The best response is to let her dig her own hole deeper." I nodded, watching Pat's daughter's car disappear around the corner. The workshop stood quiet behind me, a symbol of everything this fight had come to represent. It wasn't just about running a home business anymore. It was about standing up to someone who'd abused their power for far too long. Everything changed when Frank Miller, the building inspector, showed up at my door on a quiet Saturday morning. His usually cheerful face was marked with concern as he handed me a thick manila envelope. "Mark, you need to see this. Someone submitted these plans to the city, claiming they're modifications you're making to your workshop." Inside the envelope, I found detailed architectural drawings for what looked like a full-scale industrial operation, complete with loading docks, external storage units, and commercial-grade equipment that would violate every residential zoning law in existence. The plans even had my name and address on them, though I'd never seen them before. "These were submitted yesterday," Frank explained, his voice low. "If I hadn't recognized your name and known your actual setup, they would have triggered an automatic violation notice. Someone's trying to get your permits revoked." I didn't have to guess who that someone was. Pat Wilson's fingerprints were all over this, though she'd been careful to stay officially invisible. The plans had been submitted by a consulting firm I'd never heard of, but a quick online search revealed it was registered to her sister's address in the next town over. Jennifer was furious when I showed her the drawings. "She's not even trying to be subtle anymore," she fumed, already reaching for her phone to call Sandy. But before she could dial, our doorbell rang again. This time, it was Diana Foster, looking pale and shaken. "You're not going to believe what just happened at the emergency board meeting," she said as we ushered her inside. "Pat showed up with her lawyer and 3 people she claims are expert witnesses about your workshop's impact on property values." "What? There wasn't any emergency board meeting scheduled," Jennifer protested. Diana nodded grimly. "Exactly. She convinced Bill Parker to call it without properly notifying everyone. Only her supporters were there. They're trying to push through a retroactive approval of all her previous actions before the audit can be completed." My phone buzzed with a text from Dave Martinez. Suspicious car parked outside your workshop again. 2 people with cameras. Want me to call Chris? Before I could respond, Officer Johnson's patrol car rolled up on its own. The photographers scattered, but not before Chris got their license plate numbers. He came to my door, looking more serious than usual. "Those weren't just random photographers," he said after I invited him in. "They're from a local tabloid newspaper. Someone tipped them off about a neighborhood controversy involving illegal business operations. They've been asking questions all over Pine Valley Estates." Sandy arrived just as Chris was leaving, her arms full of documents and her expression fierce. "Pat's getting desperate," she announced, spreading papers across our dining room table. "Look at what she filed with the county clerk this morning." The documents detailed allegations of everything from noise violations to environmental hazards, all supposedly emanating from my workshop. But Pat had made a crucial mistake in her rush to bury me in paperwork. Several of the complaints were dated before we'd even moved to Pine Valley Estates. "She's recycling old complaints from other neighborhoods," Sandy explained, highlighting the dates. "She didn't even bother to change the details. One of these describes problems with a pool. We don't have." We were interrupted by a commotion outside. Bob Thompson was at our door, looking agitated. "Mark, we've got a situation. Pat's lawyer just served the HOA with papers demanding access to all records related to home businesses in Pine Valley Estates. They're claiming discriminatory enforcement." "Let them look," Sandy said firmly. "Every decision about Mark's workshop is properly documented. Meanwhile, I'd love to see them explain Pat's consulting operation." That's when Jennifer's laptop pinged with an incoming email. She opened it and let out a surprised laugh. "You won't believe this. Remember Carol from the end of the street? She kept all her correspondence with Pat about that consulting pressure scheme. She's got emails, voicemails, even recorded Zoom meetings where Pat explicitly offered to handle HOA violations in exchange for business contracts." Sandy's eyes lit up. "Forward those to me immediately. This is exactly what we need to demonstrate pattern and intent." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. More neighbors came forward with evidence of Pat's schemes. Tom Rodriguez revealed that she'd tried to force him to use her consulting services by threatening to cite his home office setup. The Chens had documentation of her attempting to leverage HOA violations to secure contracts with their friends' businesses. But the real bombshell came from Linda Reynolds, of all people. She showed up at my door looking nervous but determined. "I can't do this anymore," she announced, pulling out her phone. "Pat's been using my real estate business to help her target homeowners. She tips me off about potential HOA violations. I approach them about selling before the fines start, and she gets consulting contracts helping them find new properties. It's all documented in our text messages." Linda's hands shook as she forwarded the messages to Sandy. "I thought we were helping people avoid problems, but now I see we were creating them. She's been doing this for years, not just here but in other neighborhoods too." Sandy was already scanning the messages, her expression growing more satisfied by the minute. "This is a goldmine. It proves long-term coordination and intent. Pat hasn't just been abusing her HOA position. She's been running a systematic exploitation scheme." As if sensing the walls closing in, Pat made her boldest move yet. Her daughter appeared at the community center that evening, posting notices about an emergency neighborhood meeting to discuss the ongoing business violation crisis in Pine Valley Estates. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening, with an agenda that included votes on restricting all home-based businesses and granting the HOA board emergency powers to enforce immediate compliance. "She's trying to change the rules before she loses complete control," Sandy observed, reading the notice. "But she's forgotten one crucial detail. She's not on the board anymore. She has no authority to call meetings or propose votes. Bob Thompson immediately sent out an official HOA notice declaring the meeting unauthorized and any votes taken would be invalid. But Pat's daughter was already going door to door, telling neighbors that failure to attend would result in automatic approval of new restrictions. Let her dig herself deeper, Sandy advised when I showed her the video from my security camera of Pat's daughter approaching my workshop again. Every attempt at intimidation, every false claim, every abuse of process, it's all building our case. She thinks she's fighting for control of the HOA, but she hasn't realized she's actually building the evidence that will end her schemes for good. A manila envelope arrived at Sandy's office early Monday morning, delivered by courier, with no return address. Inside were documents that would change everything: financial records, emails, and meeting minutes from 3 different homeowners associations across the state. Pat Wilson's name appeared in all of them. She's been doing this for years, Sandy explained as she spread the documents across my workshop's workbench, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, joining HOA boards, setting up her consulting business, then using her position to generate clients through intimidation. The pattern was identical in each location. Pat would get elected to the board, begin aggressive enforcement of minor violations, then offer her consulting services as a solution. Those who paid got their problems to disappear. Those who refused faced escalating harassment until they either gave in or moved away. Diana Foster arrived breathless with her own discovery. "I've been going through old board records," she said, pulling out her tablet. "Remember that major assessment increase last year for community improvements? Half the contracts went to companies owned by Pat's former consulting clients." The web of corruption was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Pat hadn't just been using her HOA position to generate consulting business. She'd been orchestrating a complex network of kickbacks and favors that spread across multiple communities. Mike Chen, who worked in finance, volunteered to analyze the money trail. "These consulting fees are just the tip of the iceberg," he reported after reviewing the documents. "She's been getting referral fees from contractors, real estate agents, even landscaping companies. Anyone who wanted to do business in the neighborhoods she controlled had to pay to play." Jennifer was compiling all the evidence into a comprehensive timeline when Officer Johnson stopped by with unexpected news. "The department's white-collar crime unit is interested in your case," he said quietly. Apparently, Pat's name came up in another investigation they're conducting. They'd like to talk to anyone who has documentation of her schemes. Before we could process this development, Bob Thompson called an emergency board meeting, a real one this time, properly noticed and documented. The community center was packed again, but the atmosphere was different. Instead of tension, there was a sense of purpose. "We've uncovered significant evidence of systematic abuse of power and potential financial misconduct," Bob announced, his voice grave. "The board has a responsibility to report these findings to the proper authorities." Pat's daughter burst into the meeting, smartphone raised to record everything. "This is harassment," she shouted. "My mother's lawyers will sue everyone in this room." "Your mother's lawyers might want to see this first," Sandy responded calmly, projecting an email onto the wall. It was from Pat to a contractor, explicitly detailing how they would inflate project costs and split the difference. The date matched perfectly with last year's assessment increase. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about my workshop anymore, or even about Pat's consulting schemes. This was about systematic fraud that had potentially cost homeowners thousands of dollars. Dave Martinez stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "I served on the maintenance committee last year. Pat insisted we use her preferred vendors for everything, said they were pre-vetted and approved. Now I understand why." More revelations followed. Linda Reynolds, still trying to make amends for her role in Pat's schemes, shared records of real estate transactions that showed a suspicious pattern. Homes cited for major violations would be sold at below-market rates to shell companies, only to be flipped months later at a significant profit. The companies all trace back to Pat's business associates, Mike Chen explained, displaying his analysis. She wasn't just forcing people out, she was profiting from their distressed sales. The evidence was overwhelming, but Pat had one last card to play. Her lawyer arrived with a stack of non-disclosure agreements, claiming they prevented anyone from discussing her business practices. Sandy's response was immediate and devastating. "NDAs don't cover criminal activity," she announced, holding up a fresh set of documents. "And we've just received confirmation that the State Attorney General's office is very interested in examining these practices." That's when Tom Rodriguez made the most startling discovery of all. While searching through old community newsletters, he found photos from Pine Valley Estates' early days. There was Pat standing in front of a different house with a different last name, serving on the original development committee. "She didn't move here and join the HOA," Tom explained, his voice filled with disbelief. "She helped set it up. All these restrictive covenants, all these specific rules about home businesses and property modifications, she wrote them. She created this system from the beginning." The room erupted in chaos as residents realized the full scope of the deception. Pat hadn't just been abusing the rules, she designed them specifically to create opportunities for exploitation. Frank Miller, who'd been quietly investigating other properties Pat had cited, shared his professional assessment. "Most of these violations she's been citing, they're based on regulations that are either unenforceable or don't actually exist in our local building codes. She's been making up rules to create problems she could solve for a price." As the meeting continued, more residents came forward with their stories. The Chens had been pressured to hire Pat's consulting firm before they could get approval for their solar panels. Carol had emails showing how Pat had threatened to cite her home office unless she contracted Pat's services for her business expansion. Sandy was documenting everything, building a case that went far beyond HOA politics. "This isn't just about selective enforcement or personal vendettas anymore," she explained. "We're looking at a sophisticated scheme of fraud, extortion, and abuse of power that spans multiple jurisdictions." Bob Thompson looked physically ill as he reviewed the mounting evidence. "As board president, I have no choice but to formally report these findings to law enforcement," he announced. "And I move that we immediately freeze all contracts and vendor relationships pending a full audit." The vote was unanimous. Pat's carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and the full extent of her manipulation was finally coming to light. But even as the meeting adjourned, we knew this wasn't over. Pat had too much at stake to go down without a fight, and she still had supporters in positions of influence throughout the community. "Document everything," Sandy advised as we left. "The community center. Every interaction, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. Pat's going to try to discredit everyone involved in exposing her schemes. We need to be ready." Dawn broke over Pine Valley Estates with the arrival of 3 unmarked police vehicles. Detective Sarah Martinez from the White Collar Crimes Unit stepped out of the first car, flanked by 2 forensic accountants. They headed straight for the HOA office, armed with subpoenas for every financial record from the past 5 years. While the investigators combed through documents, my security cameras caught something unusual. Pat's daughter was removing boxes from her mother's house in the early morning darkness, loading them into an SUV with out-of-state plates. When Officer Johnson drove past on his regular patrol, the activity suddenly ceased. "They're destroying evidence," Sandy said grimly when I showed her the footage. "But they don't realize we've already copied most of the crucial documents." She pulled out her phone to forward the video to Detective Martinez. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Frank Miller discovered something odd about the building permits. "These approval stamps," he said, pointing to a series of documents, "they're nearly identical to official city stamps, but there are tiny discrepancies. Someone's been forging municipal approvals." Mike Chen had been tracking the money trail through public records when he uncovered another layer of deception. "Pat's consulting firm isn't just one company," he explained, spreading printouts across my workshop table. "It's a network of shell corporations, all registered to different addresses but ultimately controlled by her family members." The mechanical hum of my workshop provided background noise as Sandy examined the documents. "This explains how she's been hiding the kickbacks," she mused. "One company issues the violations, another offers consulting services, and a third one handles the contracting. On paper, they look unrelated." Jennifer was cross-referencing property records when she noticed something strange. "Look at these sale dates," she said, highlighting a pattern. Every time Pat moved to a new neighborhood, someone from her previous HOA board would buy property there shortly after. She wasn't just moving around, she was establishing a network. The detectives' team worked methodically, building a case that stretched far beyond our local concerns. They interviewed former residents who had moved away under pressure, contractors who had paid for access, and real estate agents who had participated in the scheme. Diana Foster arrived at my workshop looking shaken. "I found something in the old meeting minutes," she said, pulling out her tablet. "Remember that community playground project that got cancelled last year due to budget constraints? The funds were diverted to a consulting contract with one of Pat's shell companies." Sandy was adding this new information to her growing case file when Bob Thompson called. His voice was tense. "Pat's lawyer just delivered a settlement offer. They want us to sign a non-disclosure agreement and drop all investigations in exchange for her immediate resignation from all HOA activities." "That's not going to happen," Sandy replied firmly. "This stopped being about the HOA when we uncovered criminal activity. The state's involved now." A commotion outside drew our attention. Linda Reynolds was engaged in a heated argument with Pat's daughter in the middle of the street. "You can't intimidate me anymore," Linda shouted, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. "I've already given the investigators everything I know about the real estate schemes." Tom Rodriguez captured the entire confrontation on video, including the moment Pat's daughter threatened to expose Linda's own involvement in the fraudulent property sales. "Too late," Linda responded. "I've already come clean about my role. Have you?" The pressure was building, and cracks were starting to show in Pat's carefully constructed facade. Her closest allies were turning on each other, each trying to protect themselves as the investigation widened. Dave Martinez discovered that his own home purchase had been part of the scheme. "They manufactured violations against the previous owners," he explained, showing us the documentation. "Forced them to sell at a loss, then flipped the property, to me at a markup. Pat's shell company pocketed the difference." Officer Johnson stopped by with more surveillance footage, this time from the community center's security cameras. It showed Pat and her associates removing documents late at night, weeks before the investigation began. "They knew this was coming," he said. "They've been covering their tracks for months." The detectives team set up a temporary office in the community center, interviewing residents and collecting evidence. The scale of Pat's operation became clearer with each new revelation. She hadn't just been manipulating one HOA, she had created a sophisticated network of corruption that spanned multiple communities. Frank Miller returned with more disturbing news. "Those forged approval stamps? They're not just for building permits. I've found similar forgeries on health inspections, safety certificates, even environmental compliance documents. This goes way beyond HOA violations. Sandy was updating her case files when Carol burst in with fresh evidence. Remember those consulting contracts Pat pressured me to sign? I found emails proving she was using the same tactics with businesses in other neighborhoods. She had a whole system for targeting home-based operations. The investigation was gaining momentum when we received an unexpected visit from a former HOA board member from Pat's previous neighborhood. She did the same thing to us, the woman explained, sharing a thick folder of documents, created problems, offered solutions, and punished anyone who refused to play along. When enough people started asking questions, she moved on to Pine Valley Estates. As day turned to evening, Detective Martinez called a meeting with key witnesses. "We're dealing with a sophisticated criminal enterprise," she explained. "The HOA manipulation was just one part of a larger fraud scheme. We need everyone who has evidence or information to come forward now. Deal." The community center filled with residents eager to share their experiences. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the true scope of Pat's operations. She hadn't just been abusing her position, she had created an entire system designed to exploit homeowners and businesses across multiple jurisdictions. Sandy was organizing the witness statements when her phone buzzed with an urgent message. A whistleblower from Pat's consulting firm had come forward, offering internal documents that proved the connection between the various shell companies and the HOA schemes. "This isn't just about saving your workshop anymore," Sandy said, looking up from her phone. "We're uncovering a pattern of organized fraud that could lead to serious criminal charges. Pat Wilson isn't just going to lose her HOA position, she might be facing real legal consequences." A heavy rainstorm swept through Pine Valley Estates, matching the dark mood that had settled over the neighborhood. The white-collar crime unit had established a temporary command center in an empty storefront at the local shopping center, where a steady stream of current and former residents arrived to give statements about Pat Wilson's schemes. Detective Martinez was mapping out connections on a large whiteboard when an unexpected visitor arrived. Bill Parker, one of Pat's most loyal supporters on the old board, walked in clutching a leather briefcase. His hands trembled as he placed it on the detective's desk. "I can't sleep at night anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pat convinced me it was all legitimate HOA business, but I've been reviewing the documents, the things I signed off on." He shook his head, pushing the briefcase forward. "It's all here. Every fraudulent contract, every manipulated vote, every fake violation notice." Meanwhile, at my workshop, I was meeting with Sandy and Jennifer when Mike Chen rushed in with his laptop. "You need to see this," he said, pulling up a financial tracking spreadsheet. "I've been following the money from those inflated maintenance contracts. Pat wasn't just getting kickbacks, she was laundering money through the HOA accounts." Sandy leaned forward, her eyes scanning the numbers. "These transactions, they're structured to stay just under reporting thresholds." She knew exactly what she was doing. Our discussion was interrupted by a commotion outside. Pat's daughter had returned, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought a local news crew, apparently trying to spin the story before the investigation became public. Through my workshop windows, we could see her gesturing dramatically, likely painting herself and her mother as victims of community persecution. Officer Johnson arrived moments later, calmly informing the news crew they were trespassing on private property. As they packed up their equipment, Dave Martinez approached with his phone recording. "How about you tell them about the forged documents?" he called out. "Or the fake violation notices, or maybe the property flip schemes." The news crew's interest visibly shifted. Instead of leaving, they turned their cameras toward Dave, who was more than happy to share what the investigation had uncovered. Pat's daughter retreated to her car, her attempt at controlling the narrative backfiring spectacularly. Inside the command center, Detective Martinez was building a timeline of Pat's activities across multiple communities. "She's been operating this scheme for nearly a decade," she explained to Sandy. "Each HOA was like a franchise operation. Same playbook, same manipulation tactics, same network of cooperating businesses." Frank Miller arrived with more evidence about the forged permits. "We found a pattern," he said, spreading documents across the table. Every time Pat cited someone for violations, the only contractors approved to fix the problems were companies connected to her consulting firm. The homeowners were essentially forced to pay twice, once for the violations, and again through inflated repair costs. Diana Foster had been going through old insurance claims when she discovered another layer of the scheme. Pat made sure her preferred contractors were the only ones covered by the HOA's insurance policy, she explained. Anyone who tried to use other services risked having their claims denied. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Linda Reynolds received an anonymous email. "Someone sent me login credentials for Pat's private business server," she said, forwarding the information to Detective Martinez. "It looks like one of her employees is turning on her." The server contents were damning. Spreadsheets tracked conversion rates, how often homeowners cited for violations ended up hiring Pat's consulting services. Email threads discussed strategies for identifying vulnerable residents who could be pressured into selling their homes. Documents detailed the kickback arrangements with contractors and real estate agents. Tom Rodriguez, who had been monitoring social media, noticed something interesting. "Pat's business profiles are disappearing," he reported. "Her LinkedIn, her consulting firm's website, everything's going dark. She's trying to erase her digital footprint." But it was too late for that. Carol had already archived everything, creating a comprehensive record of Pat's online activities. She advertised her HOA position as a selling point for her consulting services, Carol pointed out. She literally bragged about being able to handle violations for her clients. The pressure was building, and Pat's carefully constructed network was unraveling. Contractors began coming forward, admitting to the kickback scheme. Real estate agents confessed to their role in the property flips. Even Pat's former employees started talking, describing how they were trained to target vulnerable homeowners. Sandy was reviewing the mounting evidence when she received an urgent call from Bob Thompson. "Pat's lawyer just withdrew from representing her," he reported. Apparently, he discovered she had been lying to him about the extent of her activities. Jennifer, who had been cross-referencing property records, made another startling discovery. "Pat doesn't actually own her house in Pine Valley Estates," she revealed. "It's owned by one of her shell companies. She's been using it as a business address while claiming homestead exemptions in another state." The implications were staggering. Pat hadn't just been running a local scheme, she had created an entire shadow operation that crossed state lines. This wasn't just HOA fraud anymore, it was potentially federal wire fraud and tax evasion. Officer Johnson stopped by with surveillance footage showing more boxes being removed from Pat's house, this time loaded into a moving truck. "We've notified Detective Martinez," he said. "They're monitoring all activity at the property now." As evening fell, the neighborhood gathered for an emergency meeting. The mood was somber as Bob Thompson shared the latest developments. "The board has voted to pursue full legal action against Pat Wilson and all associated entities," he announced. "We've also initiated a complete audit of every HOA decision made during her involvement." The community's response was immediate and unified. Residents volunteered to help with the audit, sharing records and testimonies. Even those who had initially supported Pat now stepped forward to provide evidence of her manipulation. Sandy stood at the back of the room, watching the proceedings with grim satisfaction. "This is bigger than anyone imagined," she said quietly. Pat thought she could silence everyone with threats and intimidation, but she didn't count on the community coming together like this. The State Attorney General's office arrived at Pine Valley Estates before sunrise, their presence marked by a fleet of official vehicles parked outside Pat Wilson's house. Search warrants in hand, investigators began methodically documenting everything inside the property. Through my workshop window, I watched as box after box of documents were carried out to waiting vans. Detective Martinez approached me as I prepared to start my day's work. "We found something interesting in the initial search," she said, holding up a familiar-looking document. It was a copy of my original workshop permit application, covered in Pat's handwritten notes detailing various ways to manufacture violations. Sandy arrived moments later with news that shifted the entire investigation. Pat's former assistant reached out, she explained, pulling up emails on her tablet. Apparently, Pine Valley Estates wasn't the first community she targeted. She's been running this same scheme across 3 different states, always using a slightly different name. The assistant's revelations painted a picture of calculated deception. Pat would join HOA boards under variations of her name. Patricia Wilson, Pat Williamson, Tricia Wilkins, each time implementing the same systematic exploitation of homeowners through her network of consulting firms and contractors. Mike Chen had been analyzing the financial records when he discovered something that made even Detective Martinez pause. "The money trail doesn't end with the consulting fees and kickbacks," he explained, spreading printouts across my workbench. "She's been using the profits to buy up properties in other communities, setting up new HOA schemes before abandoning the old ones." Jennifer was compiling resident statements when Carol burst into the workshop, her face flushed with excitement. "You won't believe what I just found in the old community newsletters," she said, pulling up digital archives on her phone. Pat's been recycling the same fake violations for years. She literally copied and pasted complaint letters from her previous neighborhoods, just changing the dates and addresses. Frank Miller arrived with more damning evidence about the building permits. "Those forged approval stamps we found, they're not just from our city," he revealed. "She's been using the same counterfeit stamps in multiple jurisdictions. It's a pattern of systematic fraud." The investigation took an unexpected turn when Linda Reynolds received a series of anonymous text messages. Someone claiming to be Pat's former business partner wanted to talk. Sandy arranged a meeting at her office where the partner revealed the full scope of Pat's operation. "It was never about the HOA rules or property values," the partner explained, their voice shaking. "The entire system was designed to force people into using her services. The violations were just leverage to build her consulting business. When residents refused to pay, she'd escalate until they either gave in or moved out." Bob Thompson called an emergency board meeting to share updates from the investigation. The community center was packed as he detailed the extent of Pat's schemes. "We've discovered that nearly 40% of our HOA's operating budget went to contracts with companies connected to Pat's network," he announced, his voice heavy with regret. Diana Foster had been reviewing insurance records when she uncovered another layer of deception. "Pat didn't just control which contractors we could use," she explained. "She actually owned shares in the insurance company that underwrote our HOA policy. Every claim, every repair, every maintenance issue, she was profiting from all of it." Officer Johnson arrived with surveillance footage showing Pat's daughter attempting to access the HOA office late at night. When confronted by security, she claimed she was retrieving personal items, but the cameras caught her trying to remove files from the records room. Tom Rodriguez had been monitoring local real estate listings when he noticed something strange. Properties that Pat had cited for violations were suddenly appearing on the market, all listed by the same agent, someone connected to her consulting firm. The pattern was clear. Site violations, pressure owners to sell, profit from the transactions. Dave Martinez discovered that his own home purchase had been part of the scheme. The previous owners had been forced out by escalating violation notices, all of which disappeared once Pat's preferred buyer, Dave, purchased the property. She wasn't just controlling the HOA, he realized. She was engineering the entire neighborhood's composition. The investigation expanded when Detective Martinez received a call from law enforcement in a neighboring state. They'd been investigating similar HOA fraud cases and had finally connected them to Pat's operation. The scope of her schemes was staggering. Dozens of communities affected, hundreds of homeowners victimized. Sandy was updating her case files when she received an urgent message from Pat's former assistant. More documents had been found, hidden in a storage unit rented under one of Pat's aliases. The contents included detailed playbooks for targeting different types of homeowners, scripts for pressuring them into using her services, and spreadsheets tracking the success rates of various intimidation tactics. Jennifer noticed a pattern in the violation notices Pat had issued. She targeted specific types of homeowners, she explained, highlighting entries in her database. Single parents, elderly residents, people who worked long hours, anyone she thought would be too busy or overwhelmed to fight back. The community's response to these revelations was powerful. Residents who had remained quiet, out of fear, now stepped forward with their stories. The Chens shared how Pat had threatened to report their home-based business to state authorities unless they hired her consulting firm. Carol revealed years of correspondence showing how Pat had systematically pressured her to sell her property. Frank Miller returned with building department records showing that Pat had actually reported violations that didn't exist, using outdated or incorrect building codes to justify her claims. She wasn't just enforcing rules, he said. She was making them up as she went along. As evening approached, Detective Martinez called a briefing to share the latest developments. The investigation had expanded to include federal authorities due to the interstate nature of Pat's schemes. What had started as a simple dispute over my workshop had uncovered a sophisticated criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and affecting countless communities. Sandy sat in my workshop, reviewing the mountain of evidence we'd accumulated. "This isn't just about getting Pat removed from the HOA anymore," she said quietly. "This is about exposing a system of exploitation that's been operating unchecked for years. Your workshop dispute was just the thread that started unraveling the whole thing." Now, the morning fog hung heavy over Pine Valley Estates as federal agents established a perimeter around Pat Wilson's house. Her attempts to flee had been thwarted by alert neighbors who noticed moving trucks arriving in the middle of the night. Now she faced the consequences of her actions, barricaded inside her home while negotiators attempted to convince her to surrender peacefully. Detective Martinez coordinated with federal authorities from a command post set up in my workshop, which had become an unlikely headquarters for the investigation. Spread across my workbenches, where I usually crafted furniture, lay years of evidence documenting Pat's sophisticated fraud operation. Sandy arrived with breaking news from the State Attorney General's office. "They've frozen all assets connected to Pat's consulting firms," she announced, reviewing the documents. "Bank accounts, properties, everything. The preliminary estimate of stolen funds exceeds $5 million. Mike Chen had been working through the night, tracing complex financial transactions that revealed the true extent of Pat's operation. She didn't just target homeowners," he explained, pointing to his findings. "She created an entire ecosystem of corruption. Contractors inflated their bids, knowing she'd approve them. Real estate agents steered buyers toward properties she controlled. Insurance adjusters overvalued claims that benefited her associates. Jennifer was coordinating with victims from other communities when she uncovered a disturbing pattern. Pat specifically targeted neighborhoods in transition, she revealed. Areas where property values were rising, but residents might struggle with increased costs. She'd use HOA violations to force out long-term homeowners, then profit from the turnover. Frank Miller brought in records from the city planning department that exposed another layer of deception. Those development projects she kept pushing. Through the HOA, they were all connected to her shell companies. She wasn't just collecting consulting fees, she was manipulating property values to benefit her real estate investments. Outside, Pat's daughter made one last attempt to salvage their reputation, approaching local news crews with a prepared statement. Her performance might have been convincing if Linda Reynolds hadn't chosen that moment to release years of text. Messages documenting their coordinated harassment of homeowners. Diana Foster discovered something crucial while reviewing old board minutes. "Look at these meeting dates," she said, highlighting a pattern. Every major decision that benefited Pat's schemes was made during specially called meetings, when certain board members were known to be out of town. She deliberately scheduled votes when she knew there would be minimal opposition. The situation reached a turning point when Pat's former business partner arrived at the command post with a thumb drive. She kept recordings, they revealed. Every conversation, every threat, every negotiation. She used them as leverage to keep people in line, but now they're evidence of her crimes. Detective Martinez's team began reviewing the recordings immediately. Pat's voice, calm and calculated, detailed how to manipulate property values, which homeowners to target, and how to structure kickbacks to avoid detection. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Officer Johnson maintained the perimeter around Pat's house while crisis negotiators attempted to reason with her. Through my workshop windows, I could see her pacing inside, phone pressed to her ear, presumably trying to find a way out of her situation. Tom Rodriguez monitored social media as news of the investigation spread to other communities. More victims came forward, sharing similar stories of manipulation and fraud. Pat's scheme had affected hundreds of families across multiple states, each story adding to the mountain of evidence against her. Carol arrived with screenshots of conversations from Pat's business networking groups. She actually taught seminars, she explained, displaying the evidence. She marketed herself as an expert in community management and property value optimization. She was training others to replicate her schemes. Dave Martinez discovered financial records showing that Pat had used HOA funds to pay for these seminars, classifying them as board education expenses. The depth of her deception seemed bottomless, each new revelation more shocking than the last. Bob Thompson called an emergency community meeting to address the crisis. The atmosphere in the community center was electric as he shared updates from the investigation. "We've begun the process of unwinding every fraudulent contract, every illegitimate fine, every manipulated decision," he announced. "But the damage Pat has done to our community goes beyond money." Sandy took the podium to explain the legal ramifications. "This isn't just about HOA violations anymore," she explained. "We're looking at wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and RICO violations. Pat Wilson didn't just abuse her position, she ran a criminal enterprise under the guise of community service." The federal prosecutor arrived to brief the assembled residents. Ms. Wilson's scheme was sophisticated and far-reaching, she explained. She didn't just exploit individual homeowners, she corrupted entire systems of community governance. This case will likely become a precedent for HOA fraud investigations nationwide. As the sun began to set, Pat finally emerged from her house, escorted by federal agents. The sight of her in handcuffs seemed to break something in her carefully maintained facade. Gone was the imperious HOA board member who had terrorized the neighborhood. In her place stood someone who finally realized the consequences of her actions. Mike Chen had just finished calculating the total financial impact of Pat's schemes when her daughter made one final appearance. This time, instead of defending her mother, she carried a box of documents to the command post. "There's more," she said quietly. "She has properties and accounts under other names. I can't be part of this anymore." The investigation team worked through the night, processing the new evidence. Pat's network of fraud extended further than anyone had imagined, touching every aspect of community development and property management in multiple jurisdictions. Jennifer compiled testimonies from residents who had been forced out of their homes by Pat's schemes. Each story followed a similar pattern: manufactured violations, escalating fines, pressure to sell, and properties mysteriously ending up in the hands of Pat's associates. Frank Miller discovered that Pat had even manipulated building codes, creating fake regulations that she used to justify her violations. She didn't just break the rules, he explained. She rewrote them to serve her purposes. Sandy received word that authorities in neighboring states were launching their own investigations into communities where Pat had operated. The ripple effects of her schemes would be felt for years to come. As midnight approached, Detective Martinez gathered the core team in my workshop for a final briefing. "This case goes beyond white-collar crime," she said. "Pat Wilson didn't just steal money, she stole people's sense of community, their security in their own homes. That's why this investigation matters." 6 months after Pat Wilson's arrest, Pine Valley Estates gathered for a community celebration in the park adjacent to my workshop. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air as neighbors shared stories and enjoyed each other's company, something that would have been unthinkable during Pat's reign of terror. The federal prosecution had moved swiftly, armed with overwhelming evidence. Pat's elaborate network of fraud had crumbled under scrutiny, each layer revealing new depths of deception. Her guilty plea had come as a surprise to some, but those of us who had seen the evidence knew she had no other choice. Sandy joined me at my workbench, where I was putting the finishing touches on a commemorative plaque for the community center. "The judge's ruling came down this morning," she said, showing me the official document. 15 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and she's permanently barred from serving on any HOA board or property management position. The investigation's findings had sparked reforms across the state. New legislation was being drafted to prevent HOA abuse, with many of the protections based directly on evidence from Pat's case. My workshop dispute had unknowingly triggered a revolution in community governance. Jennifer was organizing the victim impact statements when Diana Foster arrived with news from the State Attorney General's office. "They've recovered most of the stolen funds," she announced. "Pat's assets have been liquidated, and the money will be returned to the affected communities." Mike Chen had created a comprehensive report tracking every dollar Pat had stolen. "The total amount is staggering," he explained, displaying charts that showed the scope of her fraud. "But what's more important is how many families we can now help make whole again." Frank Miller brought the final building inspection reports, officially clearing every fraudulent violation Pat had manufactured. "We've reviewed every citation she issued," he said. "The city has invalidated all fines based on her fake regulations." Bob Thompson had stepped down as HOA president, making way for new leadership focused on transparency and community involvement. Diana Foster now headed a reformed board that included representatives from every section of the neighborhood, ensuring no single person could ever again accumulate so much power. The community had changed in profound ways. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now gathered regularly for cookouts and community events. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion Pat had cultivated had been replaced by genuine camaraderie. Dave Martinez organized a support group for former victims of Pat's schemes, helping them navigate the restitution process and rebuild their lives. The healing went beyond financial recovery. It was about restoring faith in community and neighbors. Tom Rodriguez documented the entire saga, creating a detailed record to help other communities recognize and prevent similar abuse. His report became required reading for HOA boards across the state, a manual for ethical community management. Linda Reynolds had transformed her real estate practice, now specializing in helping victims of HOA fraud find new homes. Her insider knowledge of Pat's tactics became a valuable tool for protecting vulnerable homeowners. Carol used her experience to start a consulting firm of her own, one focused on helping communities establish ethical governance practices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but her commitment to transparency and fairness stood in stark contrast to Pat's exploitation. Officer Johnson remained a regular presence in the neighborhood, but now he stopped by to chat with residents rather than respond to false complaints. The atmosphere of mutual trust between law enforcement and the community had replaced the previous dynamic of suspicion and harassment. My workshop had become a symbol of resistance against corruption, and I made sure to honor that legacy. Every piece of furniture I crafted now carried a small mark, a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, was always worth the fight. Detective Martinez visited occasionally, using our case as a training example for other investigators. Pat's schemes had exposed vulnerabilities in HOA oversight that communities across the country were now working to address. The federal prosecutor had turned our experience into a template for fighting HOA fraud nationwide. Similar investigations were underway in other states, using the techniques and evidence patterns established in our case. Jennifer compiled all the documentation into a comprehensive archive, ensuring that the full story of Pat's crimes and the community's response would be preserved. Future generations would understand both the danger of unchecked power and the importance of community solidarity. As the celebration continued in the park, I watched families enjoying the space that Pat had once tried to control through fear and intimidation. Children played freely, neighbors chatted without worry, and the sense of community that she had nearly destroyed was stronger than ever. Sandy raised a glass in a quiet toast. "To justice served," she said, "and to a community that refused to be broken." The sun set over Pine Valley Estates, casting long shadows across the neighborhood that had faced down corruption and emerged stronger. My workshop lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, a beacon of resistance transformed into a symbol of community triumph. This wasn't just the end of Pat Wilson's reign of terror. It was the beginning of something new, a community rebuilt on foundations of trust, transparency, and mutual respect. The HOA still existed, but now it truly served the people it was meant to protect. As I closed up my workshop that evening, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Pat had tried to shut me down, to force me out of my own property. Instead, she had inadvertently sparked a movement that would protect countless homeowners from similar abuse. The story of Pine Valley Estates would be told for years to come, not as a cautionary tale of corruption, but as an inspiration to other communities facing similar challenges. One person's stand against injustice had grown into a victory for an entire community, proving that when neighbors unite against corruption, justice will prevail. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.